In the immediate aftermath, as 4/5 of the ancient city lay in smoking ruins, Londoners weren't just looking for shelter, they were looking for someone to blame. And the evidence they found, the whispers that turned into shouts on the streets, points not to a careless baker, but to a deliberate and devastating act of conspiracy. For centuries, the official story has been one of misfortune, but the accounts from the time, the court records, and the political climate of 1666 paint a far more sinister picture, a picture of a city convinced it hadn't just burned, but that it had been attacked. We all think we know the story. Sunday, September 2nd, 1666. A baker on Pudding Lane forgets to put out his oven. From that one mistake, a firestorm erupts and consumes London. It's a simple, tragic accident. But what if it's also a lie? The official story and the tinderbox city. To understand the conspiracy, you first have to understand the city. The London of 1666 wasn't a modern metropolis of stone and slate. It was a medieval labyrinth of wood and thatch. It had grown chaotically for over 1,000 years. The streets were narrow, winding alleys, and the timber-framed houses had upper floors that jutted out, creating dark canyons where you could practically shake hands with your neighbor from across the street. This design, called jettied housing, was a fire marshal's worst nightmare, allowing flames to leap from one building to the next with terrifying ease. The city was also packed with fuel. Warehouses along the River Thames were filled with tar, pitch, hemp, and oil for the Royal Navy. Stables full of hay and straw were tucked into every corner. Add to that a long, hot, and dry summer. A drought had left London parched, its wooden buildings like kindling. To make matters worse, a strong easterly wind had been blowing for days, ready to fan any spark into a beast. This was the city that Thomas Farriner, the king's baker on Pudding Lane, called home. His job was to bake hardtack, the dry biscuits that were a staple for sailors. Late in the evening on September 1st, Farriner finished his work, raked the coals of his oven or so, he claimed, and went to bed. The accepted story is that a stray spark from this oven lit some nearby firewood. Around 1 in the morning, the house was ablaze. Farriner, his wife, and daughter escaped by climbing out an upstairs window onto a neighbor's roof. Tragically, their maid was too afraid to jump and became the fire's first official victim. When the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken up to inspect the fire, he was famously unimpressed. He reportedly scoffed, "Pish, a woman might piss it out," and went back to bed. It was a catastrophic mistake. The wind caught the flames and turned the small bakery fire into a monster that tore through the tightly packed wooden buildings and raced towards the Thames. For 4 days, the fire raged. It created its own weather, a firestorm so hot it melted the city's iron gates and the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral, which flowed through the streets like a river. The official response was slow and inept. The usual way to fight these fires was to demolish buildings to create fire breaks, but the Lord Mayor hesitated, worried about the cost. By the time King Charles II took over and ordered the use of gunpowder to create bigger fire breaks, it was almost too late. When the wind finally died down on September 6th, the devastation was biblical. 13,200 houses were gone. 87 parish churches were destroyed. The iconic St. Paul's Cathedral was a hollowed-out shell. Around 436 acres, nearly 80% of the walled city, had been wiped off the map. An estimated 100,000 Londoners were suddenly homeless. The official inquiry concluded it was an act of God, a tragic accident made worse by the wind and the flammable city. Case closed. But while the embers were still cooling, Londoners were already arriving at a very different conclusion. They didn't see an accident. They saw an enemy attack, and they were out for blood. The investigation, motive, and paranoia. To understand why so many people screamed conspiracy, you have to feel the toxic atmosphere of 1666. London was a city gripped by paranoia, fueled by war, religious hatred, and apocalyptic prophecies. This wasn't just a fire. To many, it was the fulfillment of a dark destiny. The year itself, 1666, was a source of deep anxiety. With the number of the beast, 666, right there in the date, prophets and astrologers had been predicting London's doom. This wasn't a fringe belief, it was a mainstream fear. That dread was amplified by the fresh memory of the Great Plague of 1665, which had killed up to 100,000 people, a quarter of the city's population. Two apocalyptic disasters, one after the other, felt like more than just bad luck. It felt deliberate. But people feared earthly enemies even more than divine wrath. In 1666, England was at war with the Dutch. Just 2 weeks before the fire, the English Navy had burned a Dutch town to the ground. A revenge attack wasn't just plausible, it was expected. England was also at war with its traditional enemy, France. The idea that French or Dutch agents were lurking in the city, ready to cause chaos, was a constant fear. As soon as the fire started, rumors of a foreign plot spread faster than the flames. The deepest and most vicious paranoia, however, was saved for Catholics. Anti-Catholic hatred was baked into the English psyche. The gunpowder plot of 1605, a failed Catholic conspiracy to blow up Parliament, was the defining act of terrorism in the nation's memory. Protestants widely believed that Catholics were fanatics loyal to the Pope, who would stop at nothing to destroy Protestant England. They were seen as a hidden enemy within. This explosive mix of apocalyptic fear, wartime xenophobia, and religious bigotry meant that when the fire broke out, the public's first question wasn't how did this happen, but who did this to us? The hunt for a scapegoat began immediately. Mobs roamed the city, attacking anyone who looked or sounded foreign. A Swedish diplomat was nearly lynched. A blacksmith killed a Frenchman in the street with an iron bar. The city's own militia spent more time hunting for foreigners than fighting the fire. For any foreigner or Catholic, the city itself became as dangerous as the flames. The investigation, Exhibit A, the confession with the city demanding a culprit, the authorities delivered one. His name was Robert Hubert, a 26-year-old French watchmaker. He was the perfect suspect. A foreigner, a Frenchman, and most importantly, he confessed. His story, however, was a complete mess, a mess that should have cleared his name, but instead sealed his fate. Hubert was arrested east of London, claiming he was trying to flee the country. During his interrogation, he told the authorities exactly what they wanted to hear. He was a spy, an agent of the Pope, and part of a gang that had deliberately started the Great Fire. This was the smoking gun the public craved, but the details of his confession kept changing. First, he said he started the fire in Westminster, an area the flames never even reached. When that was pointed out, he changed his story. Learning that the fire began at a bakery on Pudding Lane, he then claimed he had thrown a grenade-like fireball through the bakery's open window. There were huge problems with this new story. For one, Thomas Farriner, the baker, swore his bakery didn't have any windows. Second, Hubert was described as being so disabled by palsy that he likely couldn't have thrown anything with force. Still, the authorities pushed ahead. To test his story, they took him to the ruins of Pudding Lane. With a crowd already gathered around the obvious starting point, Hubert pointed to the right spot, and that was considered proof enough. Even at the time, few people in power actually believed him. The judges at his trial thought he was a poor, distracted wretch, weary of his life, who was essentially committing suicide by confession. But despite the shifting stories, the physical impossibility of his claim, and the widespread belief among the elite that he was innocent, Robert Hubert was put on trial. The jury found him guilty. On October 27, 1666, he was hanged. He was the perfect scapegoat, sacrificed to satisfy the public's thirst for vengeance. The final, damning proof of his innocence only came out later. The captain of the ship Hubert had traveled on testified that the young man hadn't even arrived in England until 2 days after the fire had started. He was at sea when Pudding Lane first caught fire, but by then it was too late. Robert Hubert was dead, his execution serving only to prove to many that a conspiracy had existed all along. The investigation, Exhibit B, the eyewitnesses and fireballs. While Hubert's confession played out in court, a different story was forming on the streets, built from hundreds of scattered eyewitness accounts. In the smoke and chaos, people swore they saw more than just a fire. They saw a coordinated attack. The most common claim was that men were throwing fireballs into houses to spread the blaze. A parliamentary committee was set up to investigate the fire's cause, and it was flooded with this kind of testimony. One witness swore he saw a man cutting a water pipe, the main source of water for fighting the fire. Another claimed he caught a suspicious person carrying strange, hot, black objects. People reported seeing men they identified as papists or foreigners celebrating the fire, or being caught with flammable materials. The famous diarist Samuel Pepys wrote that by September 5th, with the fire still burning, discourses are now begun that there is a plot in it and that the French have done it. To many, a deliberate attack seemed like the only way to explain the fire's incredible speed. When the wind blew sparks over fire breaks and ignited buildings far ahead of the main blaze, it didn't look like a natural event. It looked like a multi-pronged assault. Of course, skeptics argue there are simple explanations. In the terror and confusion, a falling, burning piece of timber could easily look like a thrown fireball. A person fleeing with their belongings could be mistaken for a saboteur. In a city consumed by paranoia, every foreigner was a potential spy. The mind sees what it expects to see, and London expected to see treason. The parliamentary committee ultimately dismissed most of this testimony, finding no credible evidence of a plot. But for the people who had lost everything, these stories were the truth. This belief became so ingrained that it was literally set in stone. The monument, built in the 1670s to commemorate the fire, had an inscription that explicitly blamed the treachery and malice of the popish faction for the disaster. That official accusation remained carved on the memorial for over 150 years. The investigation, Exhibit C, the grand design. But perhaps the most modern conspiracy theory points the finger not at foreign agents, but at a far more sophisticated group with a much bigger motive: profit. This theory suggests the fire was a deliberate act of urban renewal, an inside job designed to clear the old medieval city to make way for a new, modern, and more profitable London. And the chief suspect in this version? England's most celebrated architect, Sir Christopher Wren. The evidence is circumstantial, but tantalizing. Just days after the fire, Wren presented King Charles II with a fully formed, ambitious plan for a complete redesign of London. He proposed sweeping away the old, chaotic streets and replacing them with wide boulevards and grand plazas laid out on a logical grid. To conspiracy theorists, the speed and detail of Wren's plan were suspicious. How could anyone produce such a radical vision for a new city so quickly? It felt too prepared. Rumors began to fly that Wren and others must have had these plans before the fire, suggesting they either knew it was going to happen or were part of the plot. The motive seemed obvious. The old London was a developer's nightmare. A great fire, however, offered a blank slate, the ultimate redevelopment opportunity. But the historical reality tells a different story. Wren wasn't the only one with a plan. Several other prominent figures, including scientist Robert Hooke and diarist John Evelyn, also submitted designs. Reimagining cities was a common intellectual exercise for the great minds of the era. It's far more likely they saw a historic opportunity in the wake of a disaster and rushed to apply their talents rather than plotting the disaster itself. In the end, Wren's grand plan was rejected. The reason was practical, not sinister. Redrawing the map of London would have been a legal nightmare. Property owners wanted to rebuild on the land they already owned. So London was rebuilt largely along its old medieval street plan, which is why the center of the city is still a charmingly confusing tangle of lanes and alleys today. Wren was made the commissioner for rebuilding and went on to design 51 new churches and the magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral. His legacy isn't one of conspiracy, but of a brilliant mind making the best of a catastrophe. The verdict, so, after looking at the motives, the scapegoats, and the grand designs, could the Great Fire of London have been planned? The case for conspiracy is built on fear and paranoia. There was a nation at war, a deep-seated hatred of Catholics, a tragic man who confessed to a crime he couldn't have committed, and dozens of eyewitnesses who swore they saw a coordinated attack. For the people on the ground in 1666, these weren't theories. They were facts that proved London was attacked. However, the case for an accident, supported by nearly all modern historians, is grounded in simple logic. London in 1666 was a disaster waiting to happen. It was a city of wood and tar in a drought, with a strong wind blowing. A single spark was all it would take. The fireballs were almost certainly burning debris carried by the wind. The saboteurs were likely just terrified people trying to flee. Robert Hubert's confession was a tragic miscarriage of justice, his innocence later proven. And the grand rebuilding plans weren't evidence of a plot, but an ambitious response to one. The official inquiry, despite immense public pressure, found no credible evidence of a conspiracy. The persistence of these conspiracy theories tells us less about the fire itself and more about the mindset of the time. A time when huge disasters couldn't just happen. They had to be caused by secret evil forces. The fire became a screen onto which an entire nation projected its deepest fears. The overwhelming evidence points to a terrible accident, but the belief in a conspiracy was just as real, and its consequences were just as devastating for those who were targeted. The Great Fire of London leaves us with two stories, one of a perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances, and another of the greatest act of arson in history, a crime so successful it was passed off as a tragedy. What do you think? Was the Great Fire a freak accident, or was it a carefully orchestrated plot? Let us know your verdict in the comments below. And if you enjoy diving into the great unsolved mysteries of history, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.